So I introduce our speaker. Alessandra Sciutti is a tenure track researcher. She is the head of the contact unit at the Italian Institute of Technology in Genoa, Italy. The scientific aim of her research is to investigate the sensory and the motor mechanisms underlying the mutual understanding in human-human and human-robot interaction. So actually, she's quite conducting a wide research in social robotics and links this to cognitive and developmental robotics. Dr. Sciutti received her PhD from the University of Genoa in Italy, and she spent different research periods in different countries like Japan and the United States. And since then, she participated in different EU projects, and she was awarded several grants like the prestigious ERC Whisper grant that focused on investigation of joint perception between humans and robots. And also, you have to say she is very active in the international community, and she serves as associate editor in different journals and organizer in different conferences. So we are extremely excited to have you today. Alessandra, I give you the word to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share the screen. And are you seeing it properly?
Yes.
Very good. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's actually quite an honor, and thanks for all the advertisements. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity today to talk a bit about the research we are bringing forward with the contact unit. And so let me start by saying that last year, 2 years back, I was tasked with Professor Giulia Sandini and Professor David Vernon with this very challenging duty, defining cognitive robotics for the Encyclopedia of Robotics, Springer. And of course, finding out, let's say, an appropriate way to condense what is a cognitive robot was already quite difficult. But one of the challenges that we found the most compelling was to identify which kind of picture could really capture the meaning of cognitive robotics. And if you look at the publication, you'll see that we found the different options. But the one that I want to share with you today is this one. So as you see, there is this little robot, which is ICAP, and it is noticing that Sarah is looking for something in her purse. And it is also noticing that the phone is ringing somewhere, and it comprises that she is looking for it, and then acts so as to accomplish her goal, that is finding the object, and continues to show it to her until she demonstrates with her happiness that the task is completed. So I want to highlight 3 important aspects that, according to me, make this picture, actually the set of picture, very representative for cognitive robotics. First of all, it's not a single snapshot. Rather, it's a process. Because indeed, the fact of being cognitive, it's really what allows an agent to live beyond the constraints of time. Because being cognitive means to be able to commit knowledge to memory, but also to retrieve this, to internally simulate and predict the outcome of our actions and also of others' actions. And this is really, according to me, more easily captured by really showing a process rather than a single picture. The other element that comes out or stands out from this picture is that it entails social cognition. So the robot is understanding the environment, is acting on the environment, and understanding the consequence of its own action. But on the other hand, everything makes sense in light of the social interaction. It is trying to accomplish a goal of Sarah. So I think that especially for today, cognitive robotics, the dimension of social understanding, of understanding other, is really central. The third aspect of the picture is that it was staged. So currently, there are no robots that are so intelligent in some sense to be able to perform naturally in a wide open scenario this kind of task. So being able to intuitively understand what I'm missing and then come in and help me to fix my problem this way. Actually, when we are confronting robots with social tasks, they happen to fail much easier challenges So even understanding when it is the right time to move the hand forward to shake hands. So I believe that now the challenge is really to bring in cognitive robotics, to really bridge this gap and try and enable our robots to really be able to interact intelligently with us and understand us, to collaborate together. And I'm saying that it would be nice to have it now because we have seen so much advancement in a lot of different abilities of the robot. On the AI side, so on the artificial intelligence, now very, very difficult, challenging logical tasks have been solved, also thanks to the advancement on deep learning. But even if we think of motor intelligence and the ability of actually moving as a human does, well, just considering humanoids, well, we have seen really literal great leaps of advancement. So the challenge now is really to see whether we can bridge from this kind of intelligence and this kind of motor intelligence to cognition, which I like to depict with this picture because I think it really captures this idea of being able to make sense of the environment, make sense of the other, be able to predict what the environment means for the other and how the other wants to accomplish a goal, and what can I do to do the same, to help. And notice, these are two kids that are doing already very proficiently this stuff. Well, this is a challenge, and this is recognized also by the experts in the field of artificial intelligence. So it is recent, the paper by Benjo, Jangil-Kun, and Hinton suggesting that artificial intelligence has done great leaps, but the way humans are able to learn from little examples, very complex tasks, is still not under the grasp of artificial intelligence. And they hint as a possible crucial element the ability of having a common sense that really allows them to generalize what we acquire. And very recently, I attended the beautiful talk by Joshua Tannenbaum within the Developing Mind series. And he himself underlined how intelligence is not just pattern recognition. It's not just function approximation. It's so much more. It really entails sharing our models to gain knowledge, for instance. And by listening to his talk, he proposes interesting solutions to the issue. He pointed out again to this idea of having a common sense, a baby's common sense. That's a sort of starting state that really allows them to build up and grow a more detailed understanding and a more general understanding of the world. And I think that this is quite an interesting proposal, this of having a common sense. And so I asked myself, but where does this common sense start? Where has its roots? And my answer to that is that it's probably something that has its root in our sensing ability, in the way we perceive the world. By citing Professor Sandini, he proposed this idea of us seeing the world through anthropomorphic eyes, I think paraphrasing Italo Calvino. This means that when we are perceiving the world, we are not just merely capturing a photo, so to say, of what's around us, but actually our brain is transforming, it's reshaping under a lens what we are perceiving to facilitate us, to reorient our attention on what matters, to fill the gap of our knowledge. This is well known in perception science. So visual perception, for instance, is an inference. We don't just see the image that it stays in front of our eyes, but rather our brain integrates this information, for instance, with our prior knowledge. And this is done continuously to facilitate our life, even though we realize it only when it fails And that's the classical case of optical illusion. So our brain is actively shaping our perception, filling in the gaps to make our life easier in understanding, in making sense of what the world is showing to us. And this doesn't happen only at the level of perception. We are also suffering of a lot of cognitive biases. And although they, of course, bring negative consequences, they actually have functional purpose. They have been evolved to, let's say, allow our brain to refocus our attention on what actually it thinks matters most for us to be successful, for instance, at interacting with other people or interacting with the environment when our resources are limited. So this means that our perception of the world, our interpretation of the world is not passive, but it's actually and actively reshaped by our brain. I think that the paradigmatic example of this is really given by the neurophysiological findings of the mirror neuron system. The fact that we have neurons in our brain that respond, that are active, not only when we are looking at someone performing an action, but also when we are performing the action, which means that we are using our own motor knowledge that we developed with our body by acting to make sense, to interpret, even to predict what another person is doing. So it is our body that provides us with the tools to understand and facilitate our understanding of others. This implies that whatever actions we perform, well, they become intrinsically a form of communication, because the brain of the other person will resonate with the same action. And this brings in what Darwin had already understood very well in the past. So that when you are trying to understanding others in terms of their actions and their feelings, well, actions speak louder, so are much more communicative than pictures, and I can say even than words. And this is true for everything we do, even the simplest action. The classical example I make in my talks is this. We have Carlo passing a plush to our icon. Okay, what a machine sees here, it will be a movement, or maybe an apparent motion through its cameras. But what I see here is so much more. Well, first of all, I'm not seeing a movement, I'm seeing an action. I see the goal of Carlo. Carlo wants to pass the plush to Aika. Then I also notice his face and his posture. He is well addressed to Aika. He's happy. He probably wants her to Aika. And I also notice something about the relationship between Carlo and the object, because even though it's a plush, so it's not fragile, I can notice that Carlo is handling it with particular care. So you notice now I explicitly guided you through observing this, but you had already noticed all of this, especially if you were seeing Carlo passing the object for real. And that would allow you to be prepared to fetch the object in the best way possible. This is what we need to put into the machine, the ability to have this reading and to have this prediction, so as to be ready to adapt and help appropriately. And this is indeed the core of what I defined as common sensing, with the basic sense, which I think as a root of common sense. The fact of sharing perception, of enabling machine to see the words, to understand the word and other section as we humans do. But can we imagine this as being the basic, on top of which the other skills are developed, as common sense should be? Well, by looking at human development, my answer would be yes. Because if we look at the very early moments of a child's life, I'm speaking the first hours of life, the first months of life, we were born, or we very soon develop very strong abilities in detecting this regularity. We are able to notice whether there's biological motion in front of our eyes, so a living being moving or a non-biological motion from the start of our life. We can detect whether a face is directed to us. We can detect whether a person is looking at us, or soon after, where it is looking. This means that we are already very good at extracting those regularities in social interaction that are the ones that then we use to make sense of the world, to understand what matters and what doesn't matter, where we should focus our attention. So this is why we pushed, or we derived our research plan, putting the cognitive robotics as a goal, but claiming that if we want to reach this goal, the cognitive robot that can properly adapt and interact with us, we cannot achieve this without reaching first a scientific goal, which is that of understanding human cognition. And these are the steps that we are pursuing. So first of all, having an understanding of the humans, which are the perceptual, the sensory motor elements, and even the cognitive basic modules that enable humans to proficiently interact with the world and with others. Then try to put models of this ability on our robots to make them more humane, more with a perception and an understanding of the world that is more similar to ours. And the last step is actually to try and combine the sensory, motor, and cognitive skills, basic skills that we've studied in isolation, into more structured cognitive architectures. So coupling them with memory, with internal drives, with internal simulation abilities, with prospection, so as to enable the robot not only to understand, but also to adapt and personalize. As you might notice, in all this plan, in all the steps, robots are very clearly present. So they are not just the outputs at the end of the road. Rather, our approach is saying that robot, and in particular a human child robot, could represent a pretty important tool to uncover, unravel the mystery of human cognition. And someone could ask, well, you are so into human cognition and human ability to interact, for instance, why are you using a robot? There are so many other ways to investigate human-human interaction or human interaction with the world. Well, the robot integrates three very important features that the other tools traditionally used to investigate human cognition have not altogether. So first of all, it is an interaction partner, so it can actually interact with me, but it is controllable. The experimenter can decide and perfectly control not only what the robot does, but also what the robot perceives and how it decides to act upon the perception. It is moving in our own environment, so I can really effectively operate on objects with it. And last, it is contingent. So it is a unity that have sufficient perceptual and motor and cognitive power, computational power, to be able to close the loop, to sense what I'm doing and react. And this provides me the unique opportunity to have a controllable agent that goes on, that acts within the unfolding of the interaction. So that allows me to study the dynamic process while it unfolds. But then you can go on and say, okay, why a humanoid then? I mean, you can build a robot any shapes, literally any shapes. Why do you go for a humanoid in particular? Of course, humanoid have problems. No, you can bump into the uncanny valley. You can create issues in how humans perceive the robot. On the other hand, the humanoid shape, and especially the regularities of humanoid motion, occupy a special niche in our brain. So if we have enough similarity in the morphology and in the kinematics, dynamics that the robot can produce, we have the chance to tap into the very same mechanisms that are active during human-human interaction. providing us a tool to investigate human-human interaction in a controlled way. And the last question that someone could reasonably ask is, okay, I can accept as a robot, I can accept as a humanoid, but why a child? And well, this is really tied in with the origin of ICAB, the RobotCab project, which stemmed from the basic idea of trying to study an intelligent system, the baby, by building an intelligent system, the robot. And addressing the baby rather than the full-grown adult, it was not chance. Actually, it took a very strong developmental stance, because the idea is that human cognition, which is our benchmark, what we are trying to understand, is not there up front when you're born. When you're born, you have basic skills. But then over time, through the interaction with others and the environment, this develops across multiple stages. Some of the skills that you acquire during childhood, they disappear after a while. They are not there when you are an adult, but still they were fundamental to make you what you are now. And the possibility of studying development, and so starting as a model with a child, would allow us to see this planking process, this evolution, while the reverse engineering of the adult cognition could be too complicated to address. And so that's why we picked a humanoid robot child, which is actually, as I mentioned before, the ICAB, which is a very nice platform, also because it is part of an open software, open hardware community, which means that there are more than 50 now in the world, used by different centers that investigate different aspects of intelligence and cognition. And when some ability is properly developed, it is shared with everybody else. And this allows us, for instance, to advance research much faster, because I don't know, we do not dedicate our research to language, but we can leverage on the results that other groups have made in the research of language directly by sharing through this open software initiative. And interestingly, it became also a little famous in society. And he also met Angela Merkel. But here, Angela Merkel demonstrated the ability of adapting that we as humans have. And so she learned that she needed to be proactive and imitate the robot, not expect the other way around. So to come up, this is the research path we are addressing. We want to build cognitive robots, and we believe that to achieve that, it's necessary to start from this common sensing or shared perception. And to do that, we are using robots as tools. And the idea is really that we need to endow the robot with a similar ability as humans to make sense of the other section and the other interpretation of the world. And we believe that this is strongly rooted in embodied communication. So whenever we are interacting with others, we are continuously monitoring our brain below the level of our awareness. It's continuously monitoring all these little signals or these subtle properties of the action that I discussed with you before. So you can notice my face expression, you can notice the prosody, so how I change my voice tones, you can notice or how I'm moving my eyes or my arms. And all this information are used by your brain to give you a sense of what I'm going to do. And what we want to do is to actually use the robot to analyze and investigate each and every of this phenomena, and also to understand how they are coupled together, so as to enable the robot, first of all, to use the very same signals, the very same action as a form of communication as we are doing, but of course also to model the same phenomena into the robot so that it is able to read those signals when we are sending them implicitly. So let me give you a few concrete examples of what this means. So first of all, let's start with understanding humans by using the robot as tool and as a communicator. This started long time ago. One of the studies that I consider seminal for my research was the one that I conducted within the iTalk European project quite some time ago, in which we investigated whether a phenomenon like motor resonance that is associated to the activation of the mirror neurons could be applied also to a humanoid robot. So we all know that when we are walking with someone and we start accelerating, the other person starts accelerating as well, and vice versa. It's automatic imitation. We do that all the time without awareness, and it's rooted in our mirror neuron activation system. So the first test we did was, does it happen also if I'm doing something with the robot? And we found that yes, if the robot started moving faster, even if we didn't ask participants to do the same, they started to move faster as well. The interesting thing came out when, by using the robot, we had the opportunity to make it move not anymore following the regularities of biological motion. So the robot started moving at constant speed, so different levels of constant speed. Well, when the same humanoid robot started moving not following biological motion regularity, the automatic imitation disappeared. So this explained to us that if we really want to use the very same mechanisms that our brain uses to coordinate and facilitate human-human interaction with robots, playing with its shape is definitely not enough. We really need to capture the regularities in the motor control that our brain understands naturally. And more recently, we explored this also in a slightly more collaborative scenario in which the robot and the participant were doing a task together, putting Lego bricks in a box. And what we found out is that the same kind of adaptation occurred even in this more natural task. And interestingly, it is true also across different cultures, because we replicated the experiment in Italy and in Japan, and we found the same degree of adaptation, even in face of very different relationship, cultural understanding of the role of robot or the collaboration of robot existing between the two countries, suggesting that this represents a very strong basic motor-based regularity that transcends, that survives to cultural difference. More recently, we investigated something subtle. So not the communication of action pace, but rather the communication of an attitude. When I'm passing you an object, or you immediately understand whether I'm gentle toward you or whether I'm imperative, aggressive. This is the action style, and our brain is designed to be very good at reading this. Because, of course, on it might depend our survival as well. I mean, if you're aggressive toward me, you might as well represent a threat. So our question was, can we enable a robot to convey this sense, this style of actions, just through its own motion, without even showing a nice face? And therefore, we experimented a bit, trying to put the features of aggressivity, if you want, on the robot. And we found out that yes, it is possible. And people recognize verbally whether the robot is behaving aggressively or not. But more interestingly, what we found was that if we monitor the activation of the dorsocentral part of the insula in the brain of the human, which is the area that encodes this information in human-human interaction, well, what we found out is that if the robot moves properly, the activation is the same. This means that a well-designed and human-inspired robot movement can tap into the very same mechanism that support human understanding in human-human interaction. And another interesting point that I want to make is that it was absolutely not easy. So we started by assuming that the aggressivity was mostly in the velocity peak of the action of the robot. So we performed two biological motions, and one faster and one slower, and we imagined that that was aggressive versus kind, and that would have been enough. And even though when you ask people to judge, that worked in terms of explicit judgment, when we measured the neural activation, we didn't find the a similar activation as during human observation. This required from us to really retarget the richness of the regularities of the velocity profile of the agent, of the human agent, the human actor, onto the robot. Only then we obtain this beautiful result. And this is interesting from a scientific perspective, but it is also interesting from a behavioral perspective, because this activation has very strong behavioral consequences. Indeed, we measure and we found out that if the robot passes, or even just points to an object in a kind or in an aggressive manner, when you move to fetch the object, you're moving in a kind or an aggressive manner. This implies that we have also style contagion, which means that even without seeing the face of the robot, it's enough to manipulate a bit the kinematics of a very standard motion, like a pointing, to really change completely the mood and the unfolding of the interaction. And very recently, we found out that this doesn't apply only in human-humanoid interaction, but we replicated also in physical interaction with a manipulandum. So again, if a manipulandum is providing you a physical perturbation while you're performing an action, which is gentle or aggressive, then your next movement will be either gentle or aggressive. So this mechanism of, let's say, attitude or style imitation is very strong. It's very rooted in our sensory motor control, and it spans also across different modalities. And these are a few examples of how you can use the robot to study the way humans understand others' action, or the way humans perceive. And there are many more interesting phenomena that you can use the robot to investigate. But if you want to have a wider view on the topic, I would really warmly suggest to you this book. We edited it, but the authors that participate with their chapters did an amazing job to clarify why human motion is so interesting, not from only the human perspective. This is the part 1, which describes neurophysiology, how we understand the action, how we predict action, but also from the computer science, and in particular machine learning and computer vision domain, and also from the robotics domain. The third section is entirely dedicated to authors that described how human motion can be important in designing, for instance, robot motion. But let me move to the next step in our research plan. So not only having the robot move in a way that is communicative, transparent, but also allowing the robot to understand what we're doing, so sharing our perception. And to try and do that, since it's particularly challenging, we really started from the basics, and we started from newborns. Our model was newborns, and the fact that they prefer biological motion. So they can recognize, since the first 2 hours of life, whether something that moves in front of them is a biological agent or not. And we still don't know how they do that. So we asked ourselves, how can we port this ability on the robot without too much a priori knowledge? Because, I mean, a newborn can't have so much a priori knowledge. So we investigated which are the features that are characteristics of biological motion, and we come up to certain laws, regularities, in particular the 2/3 power law, that tells us that whenever we are moving, for instance, gesticulating or writing, it's very common, we don't pick randomly our velocity. We could move along any trajectory with any velocity, but we always select velocities that are related to the curvature of the movement, of the trajectory, by this law, the 2/3 power law. So curvature and velocity in biological motion are always strongly correlated. So we draw inspiration from that, and we designed a very simple pipeline in which the robot was observing video sequences through its camera, extracted just the apparent motion, so the optical flow, and from this apparent motion, it extracted geometrical features that are inspired by this simple 2/3 power law, so curvature and velocity in practice. And we passed these features to machine learning, by showing a few examples of biological motion. You see Alessia performing pointing action, transporting action, drawing, or non-biological motion, like a ball rolling, a toy truck moving, a balloon bouncing around. And interestingly, what we found is that through this very limited set of examples, with the features that we suggested, for the robot, it was possible to detect also novel stimuli, whether they were biological or not, with a decent accuracy. And even though the idea was inspired by newborns, so very simple agents, it allowed us to solve issues that computer vision usually did not solve when it was detecting agents. So this system is robust to occlusion, of course. It doesn't depend on the visibility of the skin. And it does even more. It allows you to see or infer the existence, the presence of a human where no human is in sight. And this is what you're saying here. The robot is just seeing in its field of view the stick that Alessia is moving. But since Alessia is moving the stick has features of biological motion. Then the robot has in its attentional system a drive to be oriented toward biological motion with the tool that we have discussed so far. And so it can reorient its attention and discover the presence of an agent. So de facto, this allows the robot to detect an agent when it is not seeing any part of it. And the interesting element of this basic skill is that it has actually the possibility to escalate, to produce other interesting results. Indeed, we more recently reused the basics of the method, which is extracting these particular geometric properties of the movement and extracting primitives of the movement from that to address complex tasks like action understanding across different perspectives, action similarity detection, and even to support robot coordination with a human with no needs of knowing in advance the kind of action. And the same approach has been used also to allow the robot to detect carefulness of a movement. So when in the example video that you see, the person is moving either an empty glass or a glass full of water, but the robot is not seeing the glass. It's not tasked to be able to understand the properties of the object. Just by monitoring the properties in the velocity profile of the movement of the transporter, it can infer which is the fragile object and which is not, and use that the next time it is its own turn to move the object. Of course, not only motion is a source of information. Another very rich source of info comes from our facial expression. So being able to detect whether we are smiling, whether we are frowning, not maybe to understand immediately which kind of emotion we are feeling. Of course, there is a strong debate on how facial expression are informative about the emotion that we're feeling. But in the context of an interaction, observing an emotion or an expression as a result of our action is really crucial for enabling the robot to adapt over time. And this is what we, for instance, used in the context of a training task in which the robot was somehow supporting the learning of a complex physical task, balancing this inverted pendulum. It was definitely not easy at all. You can see Julia struggling with it. But the robot is providing through this other robot, which is called the wristbot, force to support, but it is also monitoring the learning of the participant. And interestingly, it is monitoring the performance, which is what is classically done in rehabilitation and training of physical tasks, but it is also monitoring the face. And what we found out is that coupling both information is pretty useful, because by observing the facial reactions to particular moments in the task, it was possible for the robot to infer, for instance, which parts of the task were more challenging for them, were perceived as more challenging. Beyond facial expression, face conveys other information through the eyes. Eyes are the door to our souls, but more practically, they can reveal very clearly, for instance, our goal. And this is what we showed in a very old study now, in which we found out that just by monitoring eye gaze, actually the coupling between eye and head gaze, it was possible for the robot to understand what the person wanted, even without listening or understanding anything else. So no facial expression, no pointing, no audio, and without telling anything to the person. So in a very natural interaction in which the person does everything she can to explain things to the robot, the talking, nodding, facial expression, etc., extracting just eye plus head information orientation is sufficient for the robot to guess 97% of the time when it is the right moment to act and which object to pass between the two it has in its own hand. But more recently, we investigated something else. So, is it possible from eyes to infer whether a person is lying? And indeed, this is what we tested in a little study that was designed more or less as a sort of an interrogation. And it was found out that by combining information about the pupil dilation, not even eyes movement, just pupil dilation, with details about the speech, so the eloquence that the people were using in talking, well, that was enough to provide a decent accuracy in detecting when a person was telling the truth or telling a lie, both against a human interrogator and against a robot interrogator. That was interesting, but this posed us the question why pupil dilation was so informative. And we thought that this depended on the fact that it is a proxy of both arousal and cognitive load. And so this sounded particularly interesting for us because we want a robot to be sensitive about our level of cognitive load. And therefore, we wanted to see whether this ability of detective cognitive load increase, for instance, obtained through inducing people to lie, was something that we could extract autonomously from the robot side in a natural interaction, game-like, not in an interrogation very long cycle. And so we designed this game. It is a game in which the robot is showing a series of 6 cards, and the participant has to describe this card either truthfully, and for one, the person has to describe it by creating a story in practice. And the robot is handling the game, which lasts a few minutes. It's very short, autonomously detecting the turn, detecting, guiding the rule of the actions, and monitoring the information of the pupil dilation of the participant through eye tracker system. And this is interesting because at first we wanted just to perform this detection. Can the robot detect the card for which the person is lying by monitoring only the pupil dilation? And the answer is yes, with an astonishing accuracy. And this is a very basic heuristic in which you are just looking for which of the card the pupil dilation was wider. But then we wanted to add a little of learning to see whether the robot could address even a more complex task, like letting the participant to decide when to lie and for how many cards to lie or not. And by using the internal knowledge about the dynamics of pupil dilation that the robot had collected in the first phase, we found out that even in this more challenging task, the accuracy was pretty good, 70%. And if you allow the robot to adapt over time, to learn from the same subject and gather more data, then this accuracy can increase even further. And this is interesting for several applications because when we are having a robot like teaching, we are definitely in need of being aware of the state of our partner, the cognitive load that this partner is experiencing. And of course, we would like to have it to adapt without being too invasive. And this approach could potentially be one to work with. But of course, cognitive load is expressed and is coupled together with other elements that describe our states that are not all encompassed and encoded in our game. And so now we are reaching out to investigate other signals and other phenomena. And in particular, we are wondering whether this cognitive load reading could help us to understand when a person, well, faced with a threat, faced with a risk, is going to comply with the risk or not. So we have recently designed, also in collaboration with the Waterloo University, a series of experiments in which the participants are faced with several choices in a game adventure, in which also the robot participates, both physically and virtually within the game. And in this game, participants are faced with choice, risky choice, and we are wanting to see whether they follow the risk or not. And the robot can play different roles. It can either be the friend supporting in taking the right decision, but we're also exploring the possibility for the robot to be a foe, to try and act as a social engineer. So to try and trick, if you want, the participant to pick the riskier option. And we are monitoring not only the pupil dilation to assess the cognitive load, but also skin conductance, heartbeat, as physiological measure that could reveal more about the state of the person, and also a more indirect measure of their indecisiveness, that is, how they move the mouth to provide their answer in the game. And we are now finished the collection, Dario finished now the collection of the data and is analyzing them in these very days. And what we found out, first of all, is that indeed the acceptance rate decrease when the request is risky. But if you have a tricker, so a social engineer attack that a robot or even a computer character is providing you, then the acceptance rate increases still a bit, suggesting that yes, there is the risk that a robot can become an effective social engineer attacker. And the other interesting element is that by applying machine learning on this different sensors, and actually the different data collected through our sensors, then I found out that it is possible, quite with a decent accuracy, identifying, for instance, whether a person is going or not to accept a risky decision just by monitoring this information, physiological or the pupil dilation information before the decision is taken. And again, this is just a sample of the large number of cues that the robot can and should be able to read in our behavior. But another important element that the robot provides beyond being able to read and send message to its motion is the ability to close the loop. And this allows us to move beyond, let's say, one-shot interaction and investigate social constructs that are more related to the idea of rapport rather than mere interaction. And the first construct that we explored very much is the concept of trust. So how can we qualify or quantify the trust that you have toward a robot? And what we found out in a recent series of studies that are cited here is that the classical approach that sees a trust toward robots as a sort of generalization of trust toward machines or trust toward automation, which is heavily based on reliability of the machine, has to be challenged. Indeed, what we found out is that we need a more reciprocal view of trust in human-robot interaction, which is more similar to what we found in human-human interaction, where it has been shown plenty of time that I tend to trust you more only if you trust me more, so if you comply with me. And this paves the way to an understanding of trust, not as trust toward automation, but rather trust informed by social norms in human-robot interaction, as well as it happens for human-human interaction. And the fact that robot trust toward robot is not only reliance dependent, so it doesn't depend so much on the reliability of the robot, has been proved also by another series of experiments that we conducted. So the first one, relatively old, is a treasure hunt game in which we were just wondering whether a short-term 30-minute interaction with the robot could lead to an increase in trust. So Alex designed this treasure hunt game, hidden objects in a room. You have a limited amount of time to find them. The robot is there, and you can, if you want, touch him to ask ICAB for hints. And the robot will provide hints, for instance, indicating directions in the room or giving riddles to allow you to find the hidden objects. As a last manipulation in this game, we also added a betting phase. So if you had found all the hidden objects in the time allotted, the robot proposed you to bet and said, okay, you can find another object with my help. If you find it, you double your winning. If you don't find it, you lose everything. I suggest you to take the gamble. So we invited a large number of participants to the game, and we already observed from start that there is a lot of variety of attitudes toward the robots. Some people really relied on it from the beginning, others didn't care for it for a longer time. But what we noticed is that on average, the rapport with the robot, the way people related with the robot during the game changed significantly. People increased the requests that they were providing to the robot, their proxemics with the robot increased, they complied more with the suggestion that the robot was providing, going where it indicated and coming back to the robot for asking more help. And even by testing with the standardized questionnaire, the mind attribution before and after this short interaction, we found out that people attributed much more mind experience, the ability to perceive joy or sadness to the robot, just after this short interaction. And by looking at the manipulation, we found out that not everybody found all the objects hidden, but those who found them, well, all of them decided to gamble. And when asked why, a lot of them justified that by saying that the suggestion by the robot pushed them to pick this choice. Well, this could have been quite predictable. The results that, to me, was unexpected and that confirmed me that we don't know yet very much about the rapport that human and robots build through interaction was this one. So what we expected was that people who trusted the robot, so decided to bet, were the ones who would have had an increased rapport with the robot, but only if they were able to win. Otherwise, they would have been pissed, and so the rapport would have been disrupted. Well, the exact opposite happened. So the people who decided to trust the robot and gambled and lost everything were actually the ones for which the rapport with the robot increased most. And for me, these results really unveil the fact that even this simplified kind of experiments, they were not in the wild, it was in the lab, it was semi-controlled. Well, they are already good at unveiling the complexity of the construct we are studying. And coming back to the issue of reliability, we wanted to push forward the question and said, okay, the robot in that case was reliable and it worked pretty fine. But what if the robot had a breakage? If the robot breaks, we expect this will undermine severely the trust. And so we went to great lengths to find the movement failures and also audio failures that could be credible without creating risks for participants. So the robot started moving abruptly. The robot crashed in the middle of the game. And we also performed an online study. So we invited previous players of the treasure hunt game to judge a variety of failures that we created and asked them to judge the worst of them and whether they would have impacted their trust in the robot. So we picked the worst 4 failures. We verified that people would have changed significantly their trust toward the robot when witnessing it fail this way. And then we ran the real study. In this real study, we expected people to have a strong reduction in the trust toward the robot. And so we designed also a mitigation approach. For half of the 68 participants, the robot behaved transparently about the failure. So after it failed, it provided a sort of explanation of why it did. Oh, sorry, I had a malfunction in my audio system. Oh, sorry, I had a malfunction in my actuator. So our prediction was that the failures would have destroyed the trust, but the transparent behavior would have had a sort of mitigation influence on this trust reduction. What we found out was actually more or less the opposite. So it's true that the performance became lower in the presence of the failure, but the trust that participants exhibited didn't decrease strongly. And if we compare the condition in which the robot was transparent about the failure, that was the worst of all. So it didn't mitigate, it created havoc. And this is particularly visible if we compare the results of the participants who, to the same questions, from the participants who ran the online study and the participants who ran the real one. And as you can see, participants didn't change the trust at all. Most participants ignored the failure, said that they were okay. So in the real interaction, the fact that the robot failed didn't bring significant change in their trust or in their behavior. Rather, being transparent about it reduced their judgment of the robot, really interfered with the evaluation of robot's ability, of the quality of the interaction. The only positive effect of being transparent was that it reduced the cognitive load and the effort that participants do. So again, I think that these results unveil two important factors. First, even this simple kind of tasks, lab-wise, can provide important insights on the fact that we don't know very much yet how rapport and trust with robots unfold. And the other important point is that transparency, or at least this kind of transparency that we picked, is not always the right solution. So I hope with these examples, I've showed you some ideas of how you can use the robot to investigate how humans perceive and act and their cognition. You can show how you can model some of these abilities on the robot to make it sensitive. So I think it's a nice pathway, but this is just a starting point, because what we are aiming now is really to be able to integrate these individual abilities and the ability to close the loop into a cognitive architecture that is able to show us memory, prediction, prospection, internal simulation, internal motivation. And it's not that there aren't architecture, there are so many. But one thing that we notice while looking at how current architectures are thought and are inspired by humans, we realize that a lot of inspiration comes from examples like this, where you see the child is exhibiting a lot of curiosity, sensory motor abilities, learning, etc., which is very nice. But this is just a snapshot of a life which is indeed much more enriched by social interaction. So current architectures seem to have provided to the social component much less attention. And this seems to be underlined if you look at the review that Kotzeruba and Tsotsos wrote in 2020, when they tried to summarize the 40 years of cognitive architectures by suggesting which are the core cognitive abilities that are common among these architectures. And the 7 that they identified have almost nothing to do with social or affective components. And even the 8 proposed by David Vernon, which is prospection, would definitely get benefits if it were paired with social or interaction skills. Especially when other fields, like the fields of neuroscience and cognition or human cognition, have recognized the primality, the importance that social interaction have for the development of human cognition. And these are a few very short examples of what we are trying to do in this direction. We're trying to create cognitive architecture that have effective motivation at their core. And we're recently exploring whether this can be paired with a modulation or a mapping of hormonal behaviors in our body, like the cortisol one. Or we are investigating whether the basic mechanism of learning, for instance, reinforcement learning, can be empowered by a more human-aware vision, where the reward takes into account social elements like mood or rivalry. And we developed, also in collaboration with the Eindhoven University, a series of games that have a physical counterpart. It's a card games, but also a simulation environment and an interactive environment where artificial intelligence agents or reinforcement learning agent can interact with humans to actually study how different reinforcement learning processes are perceived and understood by human players. And this is available. And recently we are exploring even more complex architecture that try to adapt online to the human needs by closing the loop between action and perception. This is a robot trying to teach yoga to a group of people, but at the same time, it also has a long-term memory by which it tries to remember the impact and the emotional reaction and the performance of that particular participant for a particular type of teaching to adapt and personalize the teaching. And again, these are just a few examples of the kind of research we are trying to pursue in this direction, because we think that this is the challenge. And I think that this is really the challenge that we as a community need to tackle. And therefore, I want to leave you with two actionable points. The first one is it started quite last year, inside this open initiative, the ICOG Cognitive Architecture Initiative, which is an open source initiative started in IIT, but which has the goal of advancing our knowledge of human cognition by designing, building, and sharing a common cognitive architecture. As you can see, it started in Italy, but it's much, much open to anybody who is really interested to advance this research. And I would really push you to check the website also for the beautiful videos of the speakers who have given talks to try to tackle this, this issue of cognitive robotics. And the second actionable point is, well, if you care about cognitive robotics and you like the mission of increasing the link between cognitive science, robotics, and artificial intelligence, I really invite you to become a member of the Technical Committee for Cognitive Robotics. I've recently become one of the co-chairs of the Technical Committee. There are more than 200 members at the moment in the Technical Committee, and I really believe that this is a challenge that needs all hands on deck. To conclude, I want to reiterate the general goal. The goal is to have more humane robots, which means not robots that look more as humans, but rather robots that think more as humans, that are considerate of humans, and that therefore can adapt and properly collaborate with us. And I want to send my big, huge thanks to the wonderful group of girls and boys that are working with me, coming from a lot of different countries, a lot of different backgrounds, and without whom nothing would have been possible. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, for the exciting talk. And now we can take questions. So please, if you have any questions, use the raise hand button, and we will take questions one by one. Or you can write in the chat.
Thanks. I'm seeing the chat.
Okay, so until some questions come, I have a question actually. I'm excited a lot about the aspect of open architecture for cognition, despite the fact that I believe, most of the cognitive architectures that we have now are limited in objective or why it can be used, in which applications it can be used for. So I feel actually I understand the point that you are trying to, for example, measures signals and try to put them in a sort of complete architecture. But there are aspects beyond this, for my understanding, for example, how do you handle uncertainty? Because signals don't happen isolated way, in an isolated manner. There is some sort of uncertainty related to the persons or the environment, because they are intrinsically non-observable. So how do you handle this in the cognitive architecture so that we can have kind of inference that can lead to some behavior?
Yes, that's definitely an important point. Indeed, the kind of approach that we pursued was really to start simpler And so doing exactly the opposite you're suggesting. So to see how far can we go if we are using just one single signal? And that was to see how powerful, for instance, the gaze, or for instance, the single gesture could be. But as you say, in a real interaction, and for a robot that needs to adapt, that would not be enough. That to exactly because the uncertainty exists. And I do believe that there are two approaches that you can use to tackle uncertainty. Well, first of all, the multimodal integration is for sure one of the solutions that we as humans use by integrating, even optimally in some sense, multiple senses. This could bring an advantage, and that's something that we are pursuing. The other approach is really that of using this common sense or internal priors. So by using internal simulation through our internal models, we can imagine or predict what will happen next, and then we can compare with what is actually happening, and then progressively adjust our internal models. I think that this kind of approach doesn't solve the uncertainty issue, but it enables the robot that can act in the world to really reorient or select its action in a way that is aimed to minimize the uncertainty, at least for the factors that matter for that particular task.
Okay, thank you. So we have two questions here. So Somaya, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your great talk, Alessandra. I was wondering, I'm very interested in the trust issue of the robotics, and I'm wondering about the face of iCube. Do you have any ideas about some kind of the consequences because of its particular baby face and the trust also in like different fields? For example, we are seeing more and more robots in the healthcare field. So what is your view on having this kind of face and the building of trust and a rapport? Also, because in some of the fields, for example, healthcare, a lot of adults are being, treated, etc. And also we see a lot of robots entering those fields too. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate about it a bit.
That's a good point, and I think it has the particular conformation of childlike as a pros and a cons. Just to mention one, but more than. The pro is that if you are encountering a robot that looks like a child, your expectations about its ability, cognitive, motor, are lowered. So if the robot blubbers or if the robot makes an error, this is more easily discounted. So I think that this plays a role in the kind of a priori assumption you have in terms of what the robot should do or how it should behave to be coherent with your expectation. In this sense, the childlike face, according to me, is positive because it doesn't make people assume that the robot will have human-like, adult-like cognition, and which it definitely hasn't. On the other hand, the point that you're making in terms of the coherence with the robot features, with the role that it has, in that sense, of course, having the robot as a child probably is not positive, because the assumption is that not having a trusted tutor or a trusted helper, more like a peer in the context especially of child interaction. So, and we have ripples of this effect, I think, on the results that I described in the first experiment on trust, the one related to choosing to gamble or not, increasing the rapport or not. We believe that the part of the puzzling result was given exactly because it was felt as a child. We asked people and they judged it to be around, I don't remember if 10 or 14 years of age. I mean, it was 9 years of age, and on average. And we believe that maybe as when you're playing with a child, you are sad for the child if the game didn't pan out as the child expected, and then you feel more connected to him even if you lost. This might be one possible explanation of why we found out this increased report, and this ties definitely in with the kind of shape that the robot has. Thanks.
We have another question from Igor Farkas.
Yes. Thank you, Alessandra, for a great and information-rich talk. My question is the following. In training the robots, one often uses a robotic simulator for several reasons, not only because one does not have a real robot, but also in order to save time and make it faster, and then deploying the model to a real robot, maybe subject to some calibration. When it comes to human-robot interaction, then the issue arises how to do it with humans. So the option would be virtual reality, where one can establish the same type of scenario. And I'm wondering to what extent you have experience with that, because it seemed that in earlier experiments you were already using the real robot, but we know that sometimes the motor learning, like by reinforcement learning, for instance, very time-consuming. So how would you see the pros and cons doing HRI in virtual reality?
You touched upon a very I don't know, also recent and very hot topic, because of course, when we were faced with the COVID limitation, we really had to think of ways to test or study human-robot interaction when robots were there, but humans much less. And indeed, this idea of creating this card game that I showed you, the chef's hat, which is available, by the way, if you want to try it, was really to create a new, let's say, social interaction setting, which was controlled, but social, entertaining, and in which both humans and artificial agents could play together. So I think that for studying certain aspects, it is a good way to proceed when especially when what you're trying to learn, as you're saying in the context of reinforcement learning, would not be feasible within the context of real interaction with the robot. The problem that I see in porting to on virtual reality, even though I think it allows you, for instance, to play with features that you'd never be able to play with in reality. So it has it opens very interesting facets of research, is the fact that you have to detach the human participant from the real surrounding, which might not seem important in terms of the particular task of the interaction. But since our brain is continuously using its own internal models of the world to make sense of what's happening in a sort of intuitive physics, intuitive psychology, and just banally to understand, I don't know, which weight you're carrying, if you're making an effort or not. Your brain is using this information below awareness. When you are moving away a person from the reality, you're not in control anymore of what this person is perceiving, how this brain is integrating this information. This is the only caveat that I see in terms. I think so the pros are the possibility of doing things that otherwise would be not possible. So I think that's a merit that we will never be able to comply with our real robots that break a lot, by the way. On the other hand, it brings the additional challenge that you really would have in theory to simulate perfectly everything in the world, which is even more complex than building a robot. So I think that the two approaches are very interesting to be conducted in parallel, maybe through collaboration and others. But I think that they have the potentiality of addressing the same question in domains that would not be feasible with just one of the two.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, any other questions? We have still time for questions. Okay, until the questions come, any question comes. So I'd like just to clarify the experience of lying, like how did you were detecting lying? It was through facial expression and sound only, right?
I'm sorry, so you want more information about lying?
Explain, So it was through facial expression and sound only.
So actually what we used for the lying, in the very first experiment, we explored gaze, not facial expression, because they were wearing an head-mounted eye tracker glasses. So we couldn't have access to their facial expression. So we relied on the gaze information, and we relied on eloquence, so on details about how long they were talking. We explored also different features about gaze, so eye direction, saccades. We explored also measure of pauses or other properties of the speech, but the two features that seem to be sufficient and the best to actually classify a lie versus telling the truth in our context were the pupil dilation and the eloquence. So how long people talked in response to the robot. So this is what originally. Then when we moved to detecting lying, so in more natural scenarios, so in this interactive game, we wanted to focus only on pupil dilation to see how far we could go with just that information. And we found out that it's pretty effective. On the other hand, I didn't talk about it, but we also ran a human studies to see how we as humans would have fared, how good would have been in trying to guess the exact same lying or truth question with the same stimuli. And we found out that we are much worse, first of all, but when the robot fails, we as humans are good. So we found out that the best way actually to detect if someone is lying, at least in this context, would be to team up robot plus human, because we are looking at different things. And by asking participants to tell us what they were looking when deciding, their focus was on prosody, so on how people spoke, whether they took pauses or not, which was something that our robot by construction was not monitoring at all. And so now we are in collaboration working on actually integrating these multiple sources of information. So gaze on the one hand, pupil dilation in particular, and prosodic features to see how better the robot could become at detecting lies.
And you didn't think about the psycholinguistic, for example.
Sorry, we didn't think
the psycholinguistic aspects, like how the sentence is structured.
I know that's a very good point. No, we didn't go there yet. So we removed any kind of semantic information, and so we didn't take into account that. We noticed that when overtly asked, so not implicitly asked, participants in our human studies didn't point to that, but maybe it was something that they were using without being consciously aware of noticing this. Mm-hmm. That's another interesting input indeed.
Thank you. So we have another question from Martin, please.
Hello, Alessandra.
Hello.
Thank you very much for the talk. And on one of your slides, you mentioned robotic self. Yes. So I would like to hear a bit more about that. What's your idea for a self of the robot? And a related question is if your architecture has anything like a long-term episodic memory or something like that, because in my opinion, that's a necessary ingredient. And whether between your sessions, the robot always starts as a blank slate, or if you can accumulate episodic memories over time.
That's a wonderful question. So we are actually very strongly interrogating ourselves about what does it mean for the robot to have a self. And we have the luck of having two PhD students that come from a philosophical background who are helping us to try and tackle this question, also leveraging on philosophical literature. What we have come up so far was first of all, a sort of literature investigation of how self was treated in the context of robotics, with very interesting findings about self intended as an embodied self. So the ability of knowing which are the boundaries of the body, the action capabilities. But the vision, the idea that we are pursuing about the self for our robot would not contain only that. I'm opening this because I have a little schema in which the self is represented as 4 layers, in which you have also an important role of the social self. So how I am in relation with others, and then a metacognitive self, so how I reflect about being a self. And one thing that we are trying to do operationally to model it is to try and build a way for the robot to create experiences, where experience is not just the mere fact of collecting input from the surrounding environment, but really coloring, if you want, this phenomena, the collection of phenomena that we are creating and sensing, with also the internal state that the robot was having in that particular moment, as a way of creating memory long-term, which, however, has not only quantitative definition or a set of information, but it has also a sort of value for the robot that is somehow dependent on how we felt. I'm using a lot of quotation marks here, I'm sorry, but we are really in the verge of discussing how to best represent it in the proper way. So exactly what you were pointing out about the long-term episodic memory, we are trying to see whether we can build it in a way that it also creates, if you want, preference for the robot. So a specific personality, specific set of choices that unfold exactly because of its previous experience with the word. And that's the direction. But there is this very short workshop paper that is published on an archive. It was an HRI workshop paper by Inkao, and there I think she made a great job in giving at least the basic idea of the structure of 4 layers that constitute the self. So far, our robot is a blank slate. It's always a blank slate, and what we are doing a bit with the personalized tutoring task that I was mentioning very briefly at the beginning, and with the self-research, is really to overcome this. So we have 2 robots, and we want them to be 2 different people in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank Alessandra Sciutti today for the great talk. And as a reminder, after the closure of the talk, I will put the video online in the webpage of the event. And I will also make an announcement today for the next talk, which will be for Rashid Alam. So this time I think it's better to make it without registration because apparently there were troubles today for different persons. So it will be, I will provide the Zoom link directly. So thank you for your attendance, and we hope to see you in the next week, similar like today, in London time with Rashid Alam. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alessandra.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you.
Bye-bye.